Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So let me introduce now Josh Tenenbaum. He also does not need an introduction. I will only say that he represents cognitive science in the center and today, and I think that's a big important part of understanding human intelligence, the brain and the mind. And I would like to add that Josh has been instrumental in getting our center set up. Without him, the center would not exist. Josh.
Okay, great. Thanks to all the organizers. Tommy, let me return that a number of times over. We owe so much in the center to you, and thanks for putting together, along with Max and Gabriel, a great workshop that tries to show this vision to the rest of the community. And I hope all of you, I mean, you're all here, so I'm very pleased to see people interested in the connections between the study of intelligence in brains, minds, and machines. I have here the names of all the people whose work I'm going to actually be talking about, but they'll be highlighted on the particular slides, and I should thank them in advance. I tend to go a little bit over it, and so I want to make sure that I say that very clearly. I'm going to be talking about the work of a number of really brilliant people who I've been lucky to work with, and I'm very happy to share it with you guys here. Like many of the other speakers, I felt like I had to start off with some history, and I won't, I'll just flash this history by you now. It's exactly the same history you just heard about. But the thing I want to point to here is that there's a success story for the study of intelligence across brains, minds, machines. It's just the one that the speaker in question or we're just debating about before. And it's really about one aspect of intelligence, though, which we could call pattern recognition. It's striking, going back more than 50 years, right, that the very same circuit elements that seem to be there in early visual cortex in the work of Hubel and Wiesel, what we now call a linear classifier, seem to be useful for solving the classic problems of pattern recognition, like, say, taking a letter X and being able to recognize it regardless of where it appears in the image or what other things might be cluttering it up. And then over a couple of decades, right, that idea was scaled out into multi-layer hierarchies, the neocognitron, again motivated by the same kind of basic pattern recognition problems, but mostly on very simple theoretical examples. And then keep going another decade or two, the work of Jan LeCun and many colleagues at AT&T, just one place where you take the right, really smart and hardworking engineering, dedicated engineering, trying to make this real world, combine it with good real world data sets like the MNIST data set, and then you have something that's actually useful technology, that now it can recognize letters and numbers on handwritten checks and envelopes and so on. Okay. Again, keep going forward, make the data set a lot bigger and maybe a lot more interesting for real world pattern recognition problems like many classes of objects, many examples, and then the rest is history. You have ImageNet, you have AlexNet, and we've all seen that. Okay, and then again from the standpoint of brains, minds, and machines, it's quite striking that these same kinds of ideas have actually provided great qualitative and quantitative insight into the behavior and the brains of object recognition in humans and other primates. Okay, so what else is needed? Why are we not done? Well, here's the basic thesis of my talk, and I think you can see this in common with many of the other speakers, which is that intelligence is more than just pattern recognition. Okay. In particular, what I want to talk about is the aspects of intelligence that we could call modeling the world. So this means explaining and understanding what we see, imagining things that we don't see but could, right? Problem solving and planning actions to make those things actually exist in the world, and then building new models as we learn more about the world. These are the problems that I think are particularly interesting about human intelligence and that I want to understand. Okay. Now, it's important that this is not the same distinction. This distinction between pattern recognition and modeling the world is not the same as the distinction between, say, perception and more general flexible thinking. You can see all these more interesting kinds of thinking-like processes in perception. And I'm going to talk about work we've been doing, which is basically within the domain of higher-level, more cognitive perception, partly because that's where I think the connection between brains, minds, and machines is most readily made. In particular, I'm going to talk about two kinds of sophisticated perception as understanding and modeling the world, one having to do with how we go beyond just recognizing patterns in images to really grasp the whole physical world. I mean, look around you. Just look around the scene where you are right here. And for all of you who are familiar with the state of the art in pattern recognition in computer vision, just think about how little of what you can see and how much of the texture of the objects, where they are, all the things you could do if you were going to plan actions, move around, move things around, move people around, how little of that is really being tackled currently. Another thing I want to talk about is learning, and in particular, a really distinctively interesting kind of learning that we see in humans and maybe rats, but it's really mostly about humans, kind of one-shot learning. The ability to learn some kind of a model of the world from very little experience, maybe even just one example. And the approach that's in common to all of these is really sort of an old approach. I mean, all the good ideas are old. You could call it something like this. It's basically about a causal perception, namely that what we're doing is we're trying to invert the causal processes that generate scenes and then that generate images from scenes. It's an idea that is in many ways attributed first to Helmholtz, although I'm sure you can find versions of it going back to Aristotle, at least in the Western tradition. Jeff Hinton was and continues to be one of the best proponents of this idea. For people who are familiar with the Helmholtz machine, an earlier version of deep learning, or one version of deep learning, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about can be seen as a version of this idea, only instead of representing the causal models with neural networks, we're going to be representing them with a kind of representation called a probabilistic program. This is just a figure from a very nice recent paper by Zubin Garbani in Nature, surveying a number of developments in probabilistic AI machine learning, including probabilistic programs. And for those of you who, I mean, I'm sure pretty much everybody here knows about graphical models, you can think of a probabilistic program as a generalization of a graphical model where you use programs to represent the causal process and not just graphs. So just to sum up the approach very clearly here, right, we have the idea that we're going to be doing reasoning with these richer causal models as a kind of Bayesian inference on generative models defined by programs as opposed to, say, graphical models in Bayesian networks. And we're going to talk about then vision, a richer kind of vision that really grasps more of the physical structure of the world as inverting these graphics programs, the kind of programs that you might use actually like in the video games that Demis was talking about, where like game engine graphics renderers. And then concept learning as inverting a generative process that produces objects as a kind of program induction or program synthesis. Okay, and for those of you who are interested in deep networks, it's important to say this is not meant to be mutually exclusive with a neural network approach. In fact, I think it's quite complementary, and one of the things I'll briefly talk about is ways they can come together, but maybe that's something we can talk about in the panel. So first, starting with the problem of perceiving the physical world. Maybe to motivate this more concretely, think about some hard problems of person detection, things that go beyond the current pattern recognition approach to, say, identifying, localizing, parsing out bodies and images. I think it's fair to say that conventional, say, for example, detectors for people, which are quite good in a lot of settings, would have trouble with most of these images here. They might be able to tell you, for, say, the image in the upper left, they might be able to find the people who are in the front row of that group of bicyclists, but they're not going to be able to tell you that there's maybe something like 30 or 40 bicyclists in that scene. Or to tell you that in this scene over here in the upper right, that there's a couple of hundred people, or here maybe about 50, 60 people, and here 0 people. Right? So think about how is your brain able to do that? Or to take this problem here, this is an airplane full of computer vision researchers from the last computer vision CVPR conference. Again, conventional systems for detecting people or parsing out body pose are not going to be able to find most of the people in the scene because most of the people are mostly invisible. Yet you have no trouble combining all your knowledge about the physical world, about bodies, about airplanes. And not only can you detect the people, but you can sort of parse out where their bodies are. So let's just take, if you can see here, I mean, it's hard with the big room. I don't know. Let's take this guy here. Okay, do you see his head and his shoulder? Yeah, this is an interactive demo. Okay. Now, think about, so you see his head here, his shoulder here. Think about where his right hand is. And I just want you, I'm going to move the arrow over here, over the image. I just want you to hum when I get to where his right hand is. Is it over here? You're supposed to hum, not laugh. Okay. How about his left big toe? Okay. Hum when I get to where his left big toe is. Okay. Very good. Yeah. So how are you able to do that? Nobody can see his left big toe, but you have a model of bodies along with the rest of your model of images that allows you to solve that problem. Or to take a problem in face recognition, again, where there's been a lot of success in what I'd call the easy problems of face recognition. Here's a harder problem, which at least until recently, I mean, I'm sure there's some experts on face recognition here, and I'm actually excited that in the last couple of months, some of the best machine face recognition systems are starting to be able to solve this kind of problem. But say going back even a year, certainly more than that, the best, say, deep face type systems basically would just say this problem's too hard, we're not even going to try to solve this. So here's a picture of my collaborator and postdoc Ilker Yildirim, this guy on the left. Does anybody know who the guy is on the right? It's also Ilker. Okay. How many people can see that they're the same person? Raise your hand if you can see they're the same person. That's at least plausible. Okay. So then the rest of you should just be more daring. Okay. So as we've shown in experiments, I can show you someone you've never seen before and vary the viewpoint and the lighting conditions quite severely. And you can't perfectly identify the person. You're not going to be 99% correct, but you're going to be well above chance at, say, a hard same different task like this. And we'd like to understand how you can do it. Okay, so here's an example of doing this with one of these kind of probabilistic programs, a probabilistic graphics program. This is work, the first part of this work was led by Tejas Kulkarni, one of our graduate students, and presented at the last CVPR. And the idea here is to write down with a simple kind of graphics program. There's a face, part of it is actually modeling the 3D structure of the face and the texture. This is based on work from Thomas Vetter and colleagues and their basal face model. And then there's a simple kind of graphics rendering thing that you put on top of that to model the way the lighting works and the camera angle. And then as you can see here on the right hand of the slide, those are samples from the generative model, like samples from the prior. You run this random face graphics program forward and you get random images of faces from random viewing conditions, all right? And then perception is like running that backwards. So for example, conditioning on this image of a face you haven't seen before, and then asking your graphics program to generate a likely posterior sample, which means to say what way of setting the latent variables, the inputs to the graphics program, would most likely have made an image that looks like that guy. One of many places where we've been interested in integrating deep networks here, for example, is taking advantage of the fact that they're really good at pattern recognition. They learn really good features for pattern recognition, which in this case might provide a good similarity metric for matching the outputs of the graphics engine with the image. Namely, you don't necessarily try to match the pixels, but maybe just, say, some convnet features. That's one such approach. Now, just to show this thing in action, illustrating what I hope will be somewhat at least a little bit impressive and also something that should trouble you. Here I'm showing a face on the left. That's an input image. And then on the right, I'm showing you the model's kind of hypothesis as it tries to search around using a kind of MCMC algorithm, an elliptical slice sampler, in its latent space, trying to match that image, trying to come up with a good posterior sample. And so you can see it kind of in action. It starts off with basically a random guess and reasonably quickly narrows into something pretty good. As I'll come to in a minute, it's reasonably quickly, but it's not that quick. In fact, it's way too slow. Your brain is able to perceive this face, in well under a second, whereas this system takes much longer. It takes a number of iterations of MCMC. But what you have is not just a match at the image. You have a 3D model that you can then do some nice things with. Like you can re-render that face, imagining what it would look like from very different viewpoint or lighting conditions. And that serves as the basis for a pretty powerful invariant face recognizer. More powerful than you would get as I'll show you in a bit, than just trying to find traditional feature invariants. You can do the same kind of thing for bodies, where now you have a graphics model of a body. Here on the lower left, you're just seeing some random samples of body poses. And then, for example, if you now take an input image of this Usain Bolt up here sprinting, here's an example of trying to match that with, again, doing MCMC in the space of possible inputs to the graphics program. And again, we're not trying to match pixels, we're trying to match a kind of enhanced edge map. So what you see in the middle between the movie and the image is the sort of intermediate representation, but again, something like convnet features might be good. I mean, this is not implausible sort of thing for a mid-level convnet representation. And again, you see, if you wait a little bit, you know, this thing pretty quickly figures out this interesting non-trivial pose. And on some pretty hard pose recognition problems, it actually beats some standard, specially engineered and discriminatively trained deformable parts models. So we see these as successes, but again, I'm interested more in where their limitations are. So in particular, while they can do pretty rich scene interpretation by inverting a graphics model, they're way too slow. So here's one place where we've thought about going back to the Helmholtz machine idea from Hinton and so on, which is to say, well, maybe we could try to learn a recognition model. This is basically exactly the Helmholtz machine. It's in the same way we have a top-down generative model, we're learning a bottom-up recognition model. In this case, the bottom-up recognition model can be defined in a pretty effective way by using a convnet. And I think that's not unrelated to what those convnets were effectively engineered to do, basically to invert this kind of graphics pipeline. The key thing about what we're doing here is that the convnet can be trained, just as in the Helmholtz machine idea, from purely self-supervised data. So you don't need any labeled data. You're drawing samples or fantasies from the generative model and training the convnet to invert that, to be able to guess what from the images, to be able to guess the latent variables to the graphics program. If you then use this basically to initialize MCMC, what you can see in this curve over there in the lower right is that's just basically log likelihood as a function of time, and it solves the problem almost perfectly from the beginning. Blue is what I showed you before. Red is the convnet enhanced initialized MCMC. It's not perfect. This is sort of a log likelihood on a log scale. So that red curve there there's still actually a number of log points. And if you look closely, you can see that the guesses that the convnet recognition model makes right away kind of look almost right, but if you look at them for even just a second, you can tell they're not quite right. What we've been doing, this is now work of Ilker Yildirim and colleagues. We've been using this kind of combination top-down, bottom-up model to provide what to us are the best fits so far for a range of interesting hard behavioral tasks in face recognition. We have harder and easier problems of varying pose and lighting, and we also vary the timing. So this is just a preview of some unpublished work to be submitted pretty soon, showing that this model is able to fit pretty well a range of behavioral tasks. And then in collaboration with Vinrik Friwald, who's another one of these Brains Mind Machine Center partners, Tommy mentioned the work that he and Doris Sau did. This model is also helping to extend the kind of successes that Tommy and Joel Lebo and others had in modeling their mid-level face patches now to the most high-level face patches. Okay, so I want to just briefly, before leaving perception, just talk about where you can go with this idea. What I've talked about is by inverting these graphics models, we can get something about the 3D structure of the world. But then, of course, when I talk about having a causal model, it's not just about finding what's out there, but about imagining and reasoning with it. So I just want to point briefly to some work that Pete Battaglia and Jess Hamrick did with us a couple of years ago. Pete continues doing this kind of work in DeepMind, and I think it's really exciting that that the vision that Demis has includes this sort of idea to say, well, if you look at these scenes, for example, you can recognize that there's blocks stacked up, but you also get a sense of what we call the intuitive physics there, right? That the ones, say, in the upper left those are stable, whereas under gravity they're just going to stay where they are, whereas the ones in the lower right look like they should be falling over. And we can take this idea of, say, running a probabilistic graphics program backwards to get a 3D scene of the blocks, and then combine that with probabilistic programs for simulating physics, again, basic kind of game physics engines, run that forward a few time steps to imagine what would happen. And as you can see here, this system then imagines that the blocks are going to fall over. So that's how it can make a judgment that this is an unstable tower of blocks. Here's another sample from the same probabilistic program pipeline, again, an inverse graphics sample to figure out the 3D position of the blocks, and then a forward sample through the physics engine. And you can see they're sort of different, but the same basic thing happens. After a couple of time steps, most of the blocks fall over. So our model here does a kind of very sort of poor man's Monte Carlo, gets an estimate from a few samples like this of what's likely to happen. And we've been able to show that provides a very nice quantitative model of people's intuitive physics judgments in a range of natural scenes. So here I'm just showing 3 examples of tower stimuli that people judge in a graded way how likely this is to fall under gravity. And that scatter plot just shows shows that our model predictions versus human judgments in a range of these stimuli. The same kind of thing, though, and this is really important when we're talking about the more sort of interesting kinds of intelligence going beyond pattern recognition, and very much dovetailing with some of what Demis was talking about. Having this generative model doesn't just let you solve this task. The very same model lets you, say, answer many other questions, like how far are the blocks going to fall, or which direction they're going to fall in. Or suppose I tell you that, notice here that you have some of the blocks are one color, some of the other colors. Suppose I tell you that the gray blocks are 10 times heavier than the green blocks. Or vice versa. How will that change which way you think this is going to fall? Or if you see that the blocks fall in an unexpected direction, can you figure out that one color is 10 times heavier than the other? It's not restricted to blocks of all the same shape and size. The blocks can be different shapes and sizes. It's not restricted to just forces that are the standard ones like gravity and friction. But for example, suppose I tell you that the table is bumped from one angle or another. The very same model provides pretty much the same level of quantitative prediction in all these cases. You can also, this is something that Pete continues to do at DeepMind, use it to actually plan your actions in simple physics-based video games. And if you saw, maybe some of you saw the poster that a couple of current people in our lab, Jiajun Wu and Ilker Yildirim, and others have been doing, is basically another way of trying to integrate a physics engine approach. Here they're analyzing these simple sort of blocks rolling down inclined plane examples. A physics engine approach with a deep learning system for trying to make good guesses about the physical properties of objects, and then use that to initialize, again, in a probabilistic physics program for trying to parse out and reason about and predict the motions of objects, now taking into account things like friction and density. Okay, so in the last few minutes, I want to turn to the second topic of one-shot learning. And just, again, let me just ground this in some concrete examples. And I know it's late, but these demos are more fun if you join with me. Okay, raise your hand if you know what this is. Okay, raise your hand if you've never seen this before. Okay, good. So most of you haven't seen this before. That I could have asked the question, raise your hand if you're a rock climber, and I would have gotten the same thing, because this is a very standard piece of rock climbing equipment called a cam. All right, now the next question is is really only for the people who haven't seen it before, the non-climbers. Okay, so here's a complicated scene of a climber laying out their equipment. Can you find the other cams? I'll just move my mouse around and just hum if I'm pointing over one of those things. Again, here's the object. Now, here these are. Okay, very good. You found them. Notice they're different. They're different colors. They're slightly different shapes, slightly different versions. They're in very different positions, you know, in 3D. But you still did okay. Okay, here's another thing. Raise your hand if you know what this is. Okay, very good. Everybody knows this segue. But remember the first time you saw one, right? You didn't think it was a bicycle. You didn't think it was a unicycle or a motorcycle or a car. It was like something kind of like those, but you were able to recognize, oh, this is a new kind of vehicle or personal vehicle. And you could see other things, and you could tell it apart from the familiar ones, as well as recognize the new examples, right? How many segues are in this scene, just to get us all on the same page? 2, right, okay. Now, this ability to learn a new object concept from one example is not just about recognizing things, right? It's not just being able to pick out new instances. You have the ability to parse things into, to parse it into parts, and that's probably partly how you're able to do it, right? By knowing something about wheels and handlebars and so on, that's your ability to parse this thing into its parts is probably part of how you recognize it. You can generate new instances. You can draw, depending on how good a sketcher you are, you can draw new examples that you haven't seen before. Imagine what they'd be like. You can imagine combinations of these and other objects to produce yet still more fanciful objects like this kind of motor unicycle that maybe you haven't seen, but you can imagine. So we've been trying to study these kinds of one-shot learning abilities, where again, the interesting thing is kind of the combination of how much we can learn so quickly. The ability to learn basically a generative model of these object concepts from just one example, something that then supports one-shot categorization, but also these other more creative tasks. We've been studying this particularly in the context of a data set of handwritten characters that we created originally under Russ Solokudinov when he was a postdoc in the lab. And the recent paper that we're very excited, it just came out today in Science. This is work of Russ, but primarily Brendan Lake, who finished his PhD leading this effort and is now at NYU. And I'm particularly excited to tell you about this because I hope that this will inspire a number of people to try to work on these problems of interesting one-shot learning. And I think the data set that we collected here will be of value to many people, regardless of whether you like our kind of approach or other sorts of approaches. So I really just want to emphasize that. All the data and code for these kind of one-shot learning of handwritten characters are available from Brendan's webpage as well as his GitHub site. And please have fun. Okay, so let me show you this if you haven't seen these data before. We were very inspired by the stuff I started out the talk with, in particular Jan's work on trying to study. He was trying to really make pattern recognition with deep nets work, and he had what I think was the right idea of go deep into this domain of handwritten characters where there's really a lot to be done, develop the basic ideas, and then once they got to a point of maturity, those same principles people showed could apply to a much wider range of interesting real-world pattern recognition problems. When we first came up with this data set, we thought of it as kind of like the transpose of MNIST, where MNIST has 10 categories with thousands of examples of each. We wanted to generate a data set of thousands of categories with only a few examples each. And we did this by going to a wonderful website called Omniglot. So we've named our data set the Omniglot data set after the website that's collected examples of basically all the world's writing systems. So you can see some of the examples of these simple visual concepts. Again, they're basically no more complex than MNIST as individual items, but there's a lot of them. So for example, we have many alphabets that probably you've never seen before. We have some alphabets that nobody'd seen before because they were made up, like from the television show Futurama. It's, again, a remarkable thing about alphabets that people can make up new characters and whole new alphabets. And you can do one-shot learning here. So just, again, one more interactive demo. Actually, there will be one more interactive demo. So here's this example in, does anyone know this alphabet? Yeah, what is it? What? Is that it? So there's a range of Indian alphabet. Is that, yeah? Okay, so I don't even know the alphabet, but let's play this game. Okay, so I want you to hum again, or let's do clapping. Clap. So here's one character. Of these 20 characters down here, one of them is the same one, so I want you to clap when I get to it. Okay, here we go. Oh, sorry. Wait. Okay. Okay, very good. Yeah, so people are basically perfect at this. I mean, it's quite amazing. How can you do this? Well, here's an idea. We think you do this by basically thinking about how you would draw the characters in some form. And there's a lot of neuroscience as well as previous psychology suggesting that this is in fact something about the way people represent characters as well as many other related concepts like spoken words and speech. Okay? So look at this character and just imagine and just in the air draw how you would draw this character. So just everybody do it. Draw the character. Okay. You probably did something like this, right? Okay. It turns out that people's drawings are quite consistent, again, even for characters they don't know. So for fairly simple characters like these ones with just 2 strokes, or even for more complex characters like these ones here, which have a number of different parts. Basically, people draw them in very consistent ways, even when you don't know the alphabet. So we try to formalize this idea of a generative model, like a kind of probabilistic drawing program. This is an example of it. We call it Bayesian program learning, because basically we're doing a hierarchical Bayesian inference on a multi-stage probabilistic program. In particular, there's one stage of probabilistic program which captures the motor program, the thing that you guys were just doing right there. It's like the commands to your arm that generates instances. And it's probabilistic because you don't draw it the same way twice, and different people might draw it a little bit differently, and you need to capture that variance to be able to do all the tasks we're talking about. But those programs themselves are generated by a higher level program. That's the prior. It's a program generating program that captures your knowledge about this domain, your knowledge about how to read and write, basically. Okay. And then perception, inference, and learning is basically trying to invert this causal process. I won't go into the details, but again, you can read them in the paper. In order to make this work, there's a kind of a learning to learn process, so we have a sort of held out background set. In the paper, we mostly consider a very big background set that we hope everybody would be pleased with, like of 30 alphabets. We also have smaller background sets, which are more like the experience of humans. So you can try that out if you like trying to learn your inductive bias or your representation of how characters work from only 5 alphabets. That's more challenging. And then you can use these generative models to do all the tasks we showed you, like classification. So for example, here, if I show you one instance of these, again, these 2 patterns up there, it's 2 characters, and then I have the one on the bottom, and I want to say which one is it? Well, I think we can all see it's much more likely to be the one on the left than the one on the right. And we can do that because basically the inferred stroke motor program for the one on the left provides a much better fit to just the pattern of ink there, right? I mean, we can measure this in terms of log likelihood, and it's about 1,000 log points better. Okay, so now this, we did a bunch of different tasks here. We did these challenging one-shot learning tasks where there's a 20-way classification task. You can, again, see one. It's just like the one we did before. And we quantified how good people are at this, as well as a number of different models. People, again, are basically getting this error rates down under 5%, where chance is 95% error rate, or success rate of 95% and chance is 5%. And that's all, our Bayesian program learning model is also able to do that. Whereas a range of other models, including sort of lesioned versions of our model that leave out the key aspects, some of the key aspects of the probabilistic program and the learning to learn, don't do as well. But also we compared a range of various kinds of deep networks, convnets, and so on. And again, with a lot of hard work, you can get them sort of close to human level performance, but there's still a quite significant gap. The more interesting thing, though, that you do with these generative models that are, again, just really go beyond the pattern recognition paradigm that we've inherited from deep networks, are these more creative tasks. So here's a task where, for example, we give people a character and we say, draw another example of the character. Don't copy it, just make another instance of one. We asked 9 people to do that, and then we asked our model to do that 9 times, and then we can do a kind of little Turing test where we show other people the humans versus the machines, and we ask, can you tell the humans for the machines? So this will be our last interactive demo. For each of these cells up here, 9 of these characters were drawn by the human and 9 were drawn by the machine. So just say which of these, left or right, were drawn by the human or the machine. So in particular, machine. So raise your hand if you think this one's here were drawn by the machine. Okay. Raise your hands if you think this one was drawn by the machine. Okay. I don't remember who's right. We'll find it. Okay. What about raise your hand if you think this was drawn by the machine? Raise your hand if you think this was drawn by the machine. Okay, how about here? Raise your hand if you think this was drawn by the machine. Raise your hand if you think this was drawn by the machine. Okay, raise your hand if you think this was drawn by the machine. Okay, machine. Okay, here's the right answer. Did anybody get them all right? Well, a couple people. All right, how about here? I mean, basically you can't tell. We've quantified this, and a few people, about 10% of people are above chance statistically on this task, but most people can't tell. And we did these simple little visual Turing tasks for a number of other creative tasks, like, for example, a more interesting one even, giving people characters in a new alphabet and say, now draw a whole new character in the alphabet. These are just examples of our computer program doing that. Okay. I think I'm basically out of time, so I'll just say we think that this kind of approach is, of course, just as we saw with convnets and other classic approaches in pattern recognition. We think the principles here are much more general than just recognizing characters. There's a number of other kinds of concept learning tasks that people are able to learn from very few examples and generalize in interesting ways, and we're excited to try to apply these approaches there, but that's very much future work. So just to wrap up then, I started off calling the slide conclusions, but it's not conclusions, it's looking forward. And I think if we want to see what is the future study of intelligence integrating across brains, minds, and machines, well, we want to say, looking back, we had 50 or 60 years of studying pattern recognition, and we made a lot of progress. It may not be solved, but from my perspective, it's getting pretty close. And I think it's time, and it's very exciting that we're now able to move on to these more interesting aspects of more human-like intelligence beyond pattern recognition, to building causal models of the world that support explaining, imagining, planning, and things that are more like thinking. I think that we're going to need powerful tools, more powerful tools than, say, the neural network toolbox has given us to capture these kinds of generative models. And here I've shown you a little bit about how we're trying to do that with probabilistic programs and program induction, and shown you how these tools are already letting us capture interesting aspects of perception and learning and build more human-like perception and learning systems in machines. But there are many open questions, and I hope some of you will be interested in working on these. Like, for example, for probabilistic programs, how can we scale up inference to be much faster and much more general? If you're interested in that, check out the Black Box Inference workshop on Saturday. How can we scale up learning to more complex kinds of probabilistic programs than just the very simple programs that we did for these handwritten characters? How can we integrate these ideas with neural networks on the engineering side? And maybe most interestingly, how do these kinds of richer causal models and causal model building abilities work in the brain? These are things that we hope we'll be able to address in the coming years. And again, I hope many of you will be interested in working on them too. Thank you.
Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.